A key part of the debate over family policy issues like childcare centers on which environments are most helpful to healthy development for young children. But our public debates could be missing crucial pieces of evidence that would actually help inform better policy.
The essential infrastructure of society, and most certainly this essential infrastructure for young children, is the family.
On this episode, we speak with an early childhood expert who argues that too often childcare policy is argued as a one-size-fits-all intervention, while the data actually tells us a different story. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn. Debates about childcare policy and early childhood development in general are often couched in something that's viewed as conventional wisdom. This idea that because early learning is so important for children, it's vital that policymakers then invest tax dollars in programs like high-quality childcare. But our guest this week believes that's actually a flawed premise, and we may be doing a disservice to children and families if we don't correct the core issues around healthy development for kids. Her name is Dr. Katharine Stevens. She's the founder and CEO of the Center on Child and Family Policy. She's also the host of the Early Matters podcast, and previously she was a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where she led AEI's early childhood program. Katharine, thank you so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick.
So I've been excited for this conversation for a long time. I followed your work when you were at AEI, and then when you launched this new independent think tank to really dig into family policy and child policy. It seemed like sort of a very necessary voice backed by solid data and grounded in good principle. So I'm very excited that you're on the scene weighing into these kinds of things.
Thank you very much.
So to start off, especially in recent years, we hear often in the news about different approaches to family policy. You know, for example, the Biden administration recently promoted, I guess within the last year or two now, but the Build Back Better agenda that was heavily focused on kind of as I would say, and correct me if otherwise, but kind of a top-down approach as far as government-funded programs with respect to things like childcare, pre-K, those kinds of programs. And these are often billed as kind of infrastructure, that they're very important. They should be sort of broadly accessible for everybody. And this is one of the latest examples in these debates. There are many vocal participants who kind of echo this, I guess, core premise that the goal of public policy, this is what these folks say, that the goal of public policy with respect to family and children should be, let's get the parents in the workforce, let's get the kids in a professional, institutionalized care setting like a licensed child care center, and that's the goal. And all public policy should be oriented toward that. So I give all that to kind of frame the issue, and then I want to have you kind of give to our listeners, one, why is that? Why does it, one, would you agree that that's kind of the dominant narrative, or is there anything we're missing? And why do you think that, or a variation of that, has sort of been dominating the landscape of family and child policy in recent years?
Well, first of all, yes, I think you've got the dominant narrative exactly right. And my explanation for this really relates to what has been over the last half century or so, the increasingly prominent role of K-12 schooling in American society, actually in Western societies in general. We've come to see K-12 schooling as the human development strategy for children and young people. And it seems to me that we've, in the process of that, come to conflate human development, education and a sense of human development with schooling specifically. Over the last 5, 10, 15 years, as we've become increasingly focused on early childhood, the reason you and I are here having this conversation is there's now strong awareness very, very significant, substantial awareness of how crucial the early childhood period is. So we understand that early childhood is important, but again, we're conflating early childhood development with what is essentially early childhood school. So we're taking our K-12 lens and projecting that down to children now starting in infancy. And in fact, a kind of tagline of the advocacy movement for this is now public education starting at birth. And the problem with that is that in the first place, even in K-12, schooling is an important part of human development, but it's a fairly narrow part, even for older children. For younger children, the developmental needs of young children, particularly infants and toddlers, are vastly different from the developmental needs of older children. So even to the extent that our emphasis on schooling works for older children, it's simply the wrong approach for promoting the healthy development of young children.
Katharine, this kind of ties into one of the big picture things that we work on here at Sutherland Institute is this idea of strengthening our core institutions of civil society. And there's so much data coming out now, and there has been for years, but it seems like it's reaching a critical mass with the momentum we're seeing today around the importance of families themselves as an institution. We've talked about before, and on previous episodes, we've talked about Melissa Carney's new book, The Two-Parent Privilege. Here at Sutherland, we released a paper this past summer called The Utah Family Miracle that looked at one of the reasons why Utah has so many good outcomes on a number of fronts is because of our high rates of married couple households and strong and stable families. So there's really a unique moment in the world of family policy, but where it seems like there's some debate or some conflict is sort of these two conflicting visions. What you're articulating is, I don't know whether you call it the advocacy community or the elite policymaker class, whatever the right terms are to describe, people who care deeply and who are trying to have a positive impact are promoting this narrative of kind of an if-then statement, like you're articulating, that if we all agree that early years for child development are very, very important, which the evidence seems overwhelming, and would love to kind of have you give some examples of that. It seems that there's this assumption that if you agree with that, then you must support all these various government programs, or as you said, sort of a K-12 apparatus just extending younger and younger, and we've heard those arguments being explicitly made. So I wonder if when we think of, okay, there's these conflicting visions, is it safe to say that we need to reorient the vision as a society towards, look, the institution of the family is very, very important. If every attempt at quote-unquote family-friendly policy is only trying to improve the other institutions that are tangential to the actual family, are we missing the institution itself of parents and kids?
Yeah, exactly. And to your point earlier about the Build Back Better bill and the other initiatives that are describing early education and child care as essential infrastructure, the essential infrastructure of society, and most certainly this essential infrastructure for young children, is the family. And the schooling started as as I said, narrow place that kids went later in life than they go now, at age 7, age 8, to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's not until really the 1960s that we kind of went full on with this idea that this is the way these non-parental group institutions are the way we're going to be developing children. And that emphasis on non-parental group institutions has extended itself into early childhood, as we've been saying. And, here's the thing. People could find that offensive on principle. But leaving principle out of it, the research is extremely clear that, like it or not, the overwhelming influence on the development of young children is their families. So even if you are not on principle attached to families, if you care about the development of young children, you need to be centering your support on advancing the flourishing of the family. That is the only way to advance the well-being of young children.
I want to see if we can dig into a little bit of why this has been the case, why this sort of professional, institutionalized, program-based approach to early childhood development has been so dominant. You wrote an op-ed in 2021 for a magazine called Early Learning Nation, which is a magazine devoted to early learning, kind of early childhood policy. And there's two quotes from that piece I want to read and ask for you to expound on. You say, findings from research on two specific exceptional programs cannot be extrapolated to high-quality education in general. You go on to say, programs yielding a 13% return on investment are very good for young children, we say to each other. So high-quality early education is obviously very good for all young children. Now, that second quote, you are articulating, here's the view that's sort of dominant, but you are being critical of that. And that's in the context of some of the early studies around a couple of specific programs. We hear all the time, well, $1 invested in high-quality childcare yields, $13 or 1 to 3, whatever the right ratio is, but high investments. And you're saying that's been now applied to everything. Help us put it back into proper context.
Right. So that research that I was describing was on two tiny experimental academic research early childhood projects from the 1960s and early 1970s. One was called the Abecedarian Project. The other was called the Perry Preschool Project. And those two projects enrolled between 50 and 100 children over several years. They were just absolutely tiny and designed as research projects to explore the idea that certain kinds of intensively nurturing care for extremely disadvantaged young children could make a difference. One of them, the Perry Preschool Program, Nick, could just as well have been called the Perry Home Visiting Program, because half of it was a morning preschool and half of it was very intensive home visiting with mothers to coach them to provide high quality learning environments in their own home. So those two programs bear no resemblance to the large programs, the at-scale programs that we're talking about today. I mean, and they furthermore they were programs for extremely disadvantaged children of young single mothers. So any conclusions that were drawn apply only to that population. It has nothing to do with universal programs. They became their successes became prominent in large part due to a Nobel Prize winning economist, James Heckman, that was interested in studying those to see if investments in highly disadvantaged kids of those exact sorts at that point could pay off in the long run. And he found that it did. However, there has never been any scaling of those programs. And the successes of the children did not reach the level of achievement of middle-class kids. So it wasn't as though these programs transformed these children's lives. They improved them. And one of them, as I said, was heavily focused on supporting parents. And what we don't know is if the emphasis of those two programs had been on investing more heavily in parents, the results may even have been better. That's just not a question that's been looked at. But regardless of the high quality of these programs, the children's disadvantaged backgrounds were a great disadvantage to them. That was not something that the programs were actually able to overcome.
You're pinpointing something I think really is the crux of this debate. And for our listeners, as the folks who listen regularly know, one of our main goals of this podcast is to try to equip our listeners with a set of principles or ideas that when they're talking about these kinds of issues with their friends and family or with elected officials, they're operating from more of a principled framework, and they can feel equipped to say, well, I want to defend the importance of the family, of parents and kids having the strong family unit. But sometimes it's hard to know how to do that because of these kinds of narratives. And with that sort of debate, as you're articulating, there's sort of a really deep debate in the actual data, in the research of what's better for kids. And we need to take a break in a minute, but when we come back, I want to get into that a little bit more, because you've done a lot of good research diving into, okay, which programs actually do work well for kids, and for which kids do they work well and which don't, and kind of help equip people with, okay, here's what the evidence says about the best environment for kids. But first, I think it's important to separate two pieces of this conversation, because we usually hear arguments about quote unquote family policy with respect to childcare through two simultaneous lenses. The argument goes that, well, because we want to help more parents get into the workforce, we need to essentially figure out what to do with their kids while parents are in the workforce. So let's put them in childcare settings. And if that's the case, of course, we want those childcare settings to be safe and healthy and good for kids. So to me, it seems like it was initially, well, if parents are working, what's a healthy, safe environment for kids to be in while parents are in the workforce? Because work is important for that family and for society. But then now it's kind of shifted to, well, actually, a childcare setting is, some would argue, the best or a better environment for kids. And I want to mention a specific exchange and get your reaction to it. In 2021, Utah Senator Mitt Romney had an exchange with one of the witnesses at a Senate committee hearing that was talking about paid family leave for working families. And this exchange really articulates the core disagreement. And we'll post the link because there's a great video clip that Senator Romney actually tweeted out himself. And it's kind of this debate where he's asking the witness, are you saying that kids are better off in an institutionalized group care, professional child care environment? And she says, yeah. And he has this great quip where he says, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I was at a disadvantage when I was a kid because I was raised by a stay-at-home parent. Walk us through, is that kind of a good encapsulation of, yes, this is the core debate we're having right now all throughout the country?
Yeah, it's extraordinary, Nick. I mean, this is a very new argument. So until fairly recently, the arguments for childcare are high quality childcare. One is, and sounds like we'll get to this later, for very disadvantaged children, even if it's not curing all their problems, that investment is absolutely worth it and very important. For most kids, the argument has been that parents need to work, for financial self-sufficiency, for GDP, we need childcare to support women's careers. These have been the arguments. So it was, the economy was a win, parents' careers were a win. And now this has happened, as I said, just in the last couple of years. It's now described as a win-win-win, a win for the economy, a win for women's careers, women's, professional lives, and a win for children. And as you've said, if there are realities of life, realities of personal identity that mean that children are in childcare, many children do just fine in childcare. But as a social policy, as a picture of where we want to be as a society, the idea of building that around the idea that being in a group institutional environment is optimal for children, particularly infants and toddlers, but arguably up till age 5, that's an absurd idea. That's a terrible basis for thinking about how we want to be setting up our society.
So when we come back, let's dive into that and look at some of the examples that you've studied to, again, help flesh out what the evidence says. Just we're looking at solid data to understand what are the ideal or comparatively ideal developmental environments for kids. So we're going to take a quick break. We're listening to Katharine Stevens talk about family policy. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We've been talking with Dr. Katharine Stevens, who's the founder and director of the Center on Child, Family, and Child Policy, but we're going to continue that conversation in just a moment. I want to mention briefly, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. On that website, you can find access to short clips from this conversation. We encourage you to share on social media as part of your conversations with friends and family about the issues we're talking about today. You can also subscribe to the podcast on any of the major platforms like Google, Apple, Spotify. Just go to wherever you like to get your shows, type in Defending Ideas in the search bar, and click that subscribe button. That's defendingideas.org. Katharine, we want to continue where we left off and start to equip people with some detail. Let's give them a little bit of depth of understanding of what the evidence says on what's kind of developmentally ideal for young children, especially in that 0 to 3 age bracket. And I want to frame the question this way. It seems to me that there is often some contradiction in, again, the conventional wisdom, because it says on the one hand, okay, when a baby is born, it's very important to have paid family leave policies. So parents, especially mom, but in many cases both mom and dad, can be with their new baby because that togetherness of parents and baby is very, very important for both the baby and the parents. But then it seems like the wisdom flips to say that at some arbitrary threshold of 3 months, 6 months, whatever your program idea is, all of a sudden now when your paid family leave is up, it's very important for mom or dad to be back in the workforce full time, and therefore that's when we need government-funded childcare programs. To me, it feels like a little bit of cognitive dissonance, and rein me in if that's not right, but I kind of tee that up with you to help us understand that debate, and then what should we be learning about from the evidence about what are the really good, healthy environments for kids in early development.
First of all, I completely agree with your characterization of that. There are two things about the framing of paid leave that I find peculiar or off base. The first is what you said, which is that if you're choosing between leaving your baby in full-time childcare, say when your baby's 2 weeks old compared to 2 months old, clearly 2 months is preferable. However, crucial early development is happening far past 2 months of age. So that's which I'll say a bit more about, but that's the first thing. And then the second thing that bothers me about the framing is it's like what you're taking leave from is what really matters. So it's like what matters is what you're doing outside of the home, and you just sort of need to take a paid break, a break from what's important to just do this thing for a month or 2 months or 3 months. And that's, first of all, that's not compatible with healthy early development to be thinking of it that way. And second of all, it's incompatible with what most parents actually want. It's incompatible with the way that most parents see their own lives. So those are the two the reasons that, so of course I'm, quote, supportive of paid leave in the sense that I would much rather, as I'm sure you would think, that people were able to stay home with their babies for a month, as I said, rather than a week or 2 weeks. But it just is simply not addressing the fundamental issue, which is where is the center of gravity in people's lives, as the center of gravity in people's lives, paid employment outside the home, or as the center of gravity of people's lives, people with young children, advancing the healthy development of their child. And then the sort of to go further with that, very young children are not hardwired to develop in age-segregated group environments. That's a fourth grader can benefit a lot from a good fourth grade. An infant doesn't develop through group activities. So a quote high quality childcare center may have 2, let's say, well-trained caretakers, teachers, and 8 babies, 8 little car seats, 8 little cribs. That's just not compatible with how we're hardwired to develop. We're hardwired to develop the way we have developed for essentially all of human history, which is in a very small, familiar environment with loved, trusted, close people. And for very young children, for the first, say, 6 months, that person is the person who just absolutely dominates a baby's sort of orientation to the world as their mother. Then that expands, but it doesn't expand to a bunch of strangers or a bunch of other babies. It expands to a father or a grandfather or an older sibling. That is the way we develop. And so unless we are setting our society up to support the healthy development as we know it needs to occur, we're shortchanging kids.
So, Katharine, to go back to something that we talked about in the first segment, again, there's sort of two sides of the coin to this issue. Is on the one hand, when parents are in the workforce, or if they need to be in the workforce, again, whether it's a single parent household or they're lower income and they have to both work to pay the bills, whatever the circumstance is, if parents are in the workforce, of course, we want and we should have safe, healthy environments for kids to be in when parents are at the workforce. But it seems to me that it's one thing to say, well, this may not be quite as quote unquote ideal for the child, but it still can be a good environment while parents are at work. That's a different framing than what we hear now, that kids being put into, again, these group care institutionalized settings, as you call it, is not just, well, if it's necessary, let's make sure it's good. It's now being framed as this is a fundamentally good and better alternative than what they would be otherwise. And it's kind of shared as a blanket statement, but you've dug into the research, and in particular, when you were at AEI, there was a paper that you helped write called "Does Pre-K Work?", where you went through a number of different pre-K programs, and you've talked before about some of the different early childhood programs. The kind of the takeaway that I have from reading some of your work is that there is no blanket statement that we can apply to the varied experiences and needs of development for young kids. So give us what's the right approach. What does the best evidence say that whether for some kids in some circumstances, this can be a better environment? Or is there kind of a general rule we can apply? Help us understand what's the right way to sort of create a framework around what the evidence says is the best in terms of environments for kids in their early development.
So as I've been saying, what young children need for healthy development is responsive, loving, nurturing, one-on-one care. That's what they need for development. And the closer we can get to that, the better off the child is. So there's one of the programs that's been studied along these lines is the Universal Child Care Program that Canada put into place a number of years ago. And what the researchers found was that for very disadvantaged children, particularly from single parent families, those children, on average, these are all averages, so it's not telling us about any individual child, but on average, those children did benefit from high quality childcare. And the observation that the researchers made is that whether a child benefits or does not benefit from high quality childcare depends on the quality of the alternative. So if even high quality childcare, which is not an environment that is set up optimally for early development, if the alternative is an absence of nurturing care in some other environment due to substance abuse, or due to just no one being around, due to people who you're with people who just don't even want to take care of you, that is definitely a worse environment. But being at home with a person, a mother, a father, a grandmother who is there every day, who loves you, where you are in a familiar, safe, nurtured environment, that is going to be better for your development than being in a group setting. So the way we need to think about this is, number one, maximizing the amount of time that parents are able to spend raising their own young children, or to flip it around, maximize the amount of time that young children are able to spend with their own parents. Thing one. And then thing two, for the proportion of families in our society who are especially disadvantaged, often single parent families, we are doing the right thing by investing in really high quality for those children, because they are going to be dependent on the quality of the childcare environment in a way that other children aren't. That childcare environment may be filling important gaps in the child's home environment, as opposed to displacing a home environment that would have been preferable.
It essentially seems like the data around the varied benefits of childcare programs for different kinds of kids speaks to kind of being a rebuttal of the message that we should have universal top-down programs in either pre-K or early childhood development. Instead, they should be targeted interventions where they can do a lot of good, but not necessarily supplant other healthy family environments. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you have a bad infection, you need antibiotics. And those can cure you. Those could even save your life. That doesn't mean that we just go give everybody antibiotics, right? It just because we observe that it works for this one group of people in this one circumstance does not in any way indicate that it's optimal. And there is no evidence. We have zero evidence to suggest that group institutional environments are developmentally optimal for young children. As I said before, what we do have is a very strong emphasis in our society on K-12 schooling. We're very accustomed to thinking of these buildings that children go to by themselves as the way we advance their development. So we're in the habit of thinking of non-parental group settings as advancing development. And even the K-12 schools are failing many kids. So that reliance even falls short in K-12. But as I've said, leaving that out of it, with young children, the approach is completely nonsensical to start with, which doesn't mean, obviously, that children, as I said, they can be in a group institutional environment. They can do fine if their home environment is extremely stressed or violent, or has kind of conditions that are damaging to a child. Then obviously being in a group environment that's at least, as you've said, safe and caring is preferable. But to make that the standard is it makes no sense at all. The other thing I've been thinking about is something we don't talk about much, which is the difference between a contract and a covenant. And a covenant is based on love, on a personal love. And a contract is an exchange. So I pay you and you take care of my child. And I think that is a dimension of this we need to be focused more on, that the element of love for a child to be with someone who loves them as much as possible is what makes sense. You cannot pay the highest quality teacher. You cannot pay that person to love the children. They can't possibly. If a teacher has 8 children, 8 babies in their classroom, they're there for a year, then they leave the next year, or even if there are a few models, which I think are preferable, where the teacher stays with the child for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years in a row. But a teacher can't love that child. The child isn't their child. That's a relationship for a particular period of time where the teacher has a certain obligations, is paid for those obligations, can be an amazing caregiver in that setting. But the element of love is very important in early development, and we're not focusing enough on that.
One of I think the core principles that you're touching on is this idea of parental time with children. And it seems to me that our debates, if our family policy debates view parental time with children as an obstacle to workforce participation, rather than parental time with children being viewed as an asset to strong families, we need to reorient our focus on, again, the institution of the family as being really helpful and vital for a thriving society. We have a couple minutes before we'll go to our next break, and I want to run a couple of stats by you from some survey data here in Utah through the Gardner Policy Institute that asked parents kind of what's your ideal scenario. This is couched in terms of, okay, how do you balance work with caring for your kids in the way that works best for you? I think perhaps the most striking finding from the survey is that 81% of Utah parents say that ideally they would want themselves or a parent or guardian or step-parent to be the one providing care for their kids when kids are not in school. So that's a huge supermajority of Utah parents saying we want to prioritize parental caregiving. When asked kind of what's your current and ideal as far as balancing work and caring for children, 37% of 2 full-time workers, so 37% said that currently both parents are working full-time, but only 17% said that was their ideal. And so there's definitely a mismatch between what parental workforce engagement looks like and what they would prefer to do with respect to their kids. The last one that I'll mention is that, two that I'll mention is that about 66% of Utah households where both parents are in the workforce said that the reason, and this is full-time, so of 2-parent households where both parents are working full-time, 66% of those households say the reason we're having that arrangement is because we just need 2 incomes to cover our household expenses. The last stat, and I realize I'm throwing a lot at you, but I think it helps to illustrate your point and would ask for your reaction to this. When Utah families were asked, if your family could comfortably meet all household expenses on a single income, which of the following arrangements do you think would be best for your family? 53% answered one parent working full-time, the other doesn't work and is the primary caregiver of our children. Another 31% said one parent working full-time, the other is working part-time, but still serves as the primary caregiver for our children. There's some other breakdown in there, but Utah families essentially are saying, we want to elevate parental time with children, but economic forces make that hard, and they're looking for more flexibility from the workforce to still be able to engage in the workforce, maybe part-time or through remote opportunities, but not at the expense of parental time with kids. How does that survey data sort of jive with what you have seen in the actual evidence of early childhood development?
Right. Well, I think that the bottom line there is that parents have very strong instincts in the correct direction. And my observation is that when you speak to most individual people with young children, that's how they feel. So the what I've been talking about, which is this, the science of early development and the notion of young children being around, spending time with people who are there because they love them, as opposed to there because they're paid to be there, no matter how good they are, right? Parents instinctively understand that makes more sense. And I think that this argument that the economy can't afford it, GDP, workforce participation. We can't be taking parents out of the workforce full or part-time for 2 or 3 or 4 years. An interesting thing in U.S. history that was kind of mirrors this was the debate around child labor. So when there was no prohibition in this country against child labor, many children did not go to school. They worked starting sometimes as young as age 4 or 5. And when people started to think that there was something wrong with this, that this was damaging children in some way, one of the major responses was our economy requires this. And somehow we managed to develop an economy in which not only are we, or do we not have child labor, we've taken children completely out of the labor market from kindergarten through 12th grade, often into community college, decades of people who used to participate in the labor market, who are not participating in the labor market, because we've decided that that is what we need for human capital development in our society. And so similarly, the idea that we can't possibly afford to have a parent, we're not talking kindergarten through, we're not talking 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We're saying 2 or 3 or maximum 4 years that a person is out of the labor market, in some cases full-time, in some cases just part-time. That for exactly the same reasons, that's the way society supports the healthy human development that we require for a thriving society.
Katharine, we need to go to a break, but when we come back, I want to finish off the conversation with kind of a what's next question. How do we take all of this and apply it to the debates we're having right now over public policy, over what should we actually do in terms of legislation or community programs with respect to childcare? Because I think it's important to not frame it as, hey, childcare is a bad thing. It can be a very, very powerful, positive resource for many families. Again, the survey data is showing there are majorities that would prefer to prioritize parental caregiving, but the childcare apparatus is still something that, again, can be very important and beneficial, and the folks who work in that industry do a lot of good. And so I want to make sure we're putting that in proper context and then see if we can develop kind of a framework of, hey, policymakers that are looking at this, here's a way you can approach all these different interventions and sort of having a rebalancing of what the evidence says and what parents want with respect to how kids are cared for in homes versus another setting. So let's jump into that and finish off our conversation. We'll come right back with Dr. Katharine Stevens on Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and we've been talking with Dr. Katharine Stevens about child policy, family policy, and some implications for policymakers across the nation and here in Utah, which we'll get into in this final segment. First, I want to remind you, if you're enjoying what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can access short clips from this episode that you can share on social media and in your conversations with friends and family. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, all the major platforms. Wherever you like to get your shows, just search for Defending Ideas and hit subscribe. That's defendingideas.org. Katharine, as we finish off this conversation, I'd like to have kind of a what's next discussion. We've talked about a lot of really, really insightful principles and some of what the data and evidence says. So now, how do we turn that into what our policymakers should be paying attention to and what our listeners as voters should be thinking about when they're discussing these issues? And I want to give kind of some big picture framing because it really does feel like as a state and a nation, we're at a pivot point when it comes to family policy. There have been so many contributions to the public dialogue. We've mentioned already Melissa Carney's book, The Two-Parent Privilege, some of the work that Sutherland Institute has done. One of our visiting scholars is Brad Wilcox of the Institute for Family Studies. He was recently on your podcast as well. So there's so much momentum in a positive way around the importance of families as an institution. And it seems like it's a really unique opportunity to help to reorient our national and state-based policy to really support families themselves. But it also seems like these issues are so easily put into a right versus left framing, kind of that partisan, gridlock or division. And this issue can fall prey to that, but it doesn't always fall prey. There is actually some cross-partisan realization around the importance of family. Melissa Carney is one of them. As a Brookings scholar, she said, she's not necessarily approaching this as a conservative. She's looking at the evidence. What's your reaction to that? How do you approach this issue, knowing that there's this unique momentum and it doesn't have to be just another right versus left kind of battle?
Yeah, exactly. Like Melissa, my background is actually not on the right. I was at AEI for 6 years. Most of what I focus on and write about seems to be aligned with the right. But one of the things I've observed that I think is especially exciting is that the most innovative, creative, forward-looking thinking that I see in early childhood is now coming from the right. That there's I think, informed by new brain science, new generations of conservatives. So to me, that's extremely promising, that there is kind of a new energy and new potential, hopefully for bipartisan approaches, because I see the right stepping up and engaging with early childhood in a way that I've never seen before.
So recognizing it, we're kind of in uncharted territory, right? You have folks on the right and the left finding this common set of principles of the family institution is really, really important. And setting aside, there may be some people say, well, we've been saying this for years and, welcome to the party kind of thing. I think it's good to not get too mired in those kinds of things and focus on, okay, if we're all sort of coalescing around some shared principles and shared realization of what the data is saying, as you mentioned, the brain science and some of the economic outcomes of the importance of family, seems to be that the next step is to turn that into tangible policy that can actually benefit families. And I want to ask if you can help give our listeners and even the audience of Utah policymakers here in our state sort of a principled and evidence-based framework that can help them approach this issue, because sometimes it's very complex. So I'll just start with that. What is the first, or maybe some of the things that come to mind to you that you said, okay, if I'm speaking to voters or to policymakers, here's some things that should guide how we do child and family policy in our state and in other states?
Yes. So as you were just saying, I think the first thing that is extraordinary is the degree to which voters and policymakers are recognizing that spending public money and investing, as we say, in families with young children, in the development of young children, is something that is worthy of our money, and that's fairly new, as especially on the right. So the fact that this is a conversation that's being had, that people are recognizing this is such a crucial period in the human lifespan, that we need to be paying more attention to it than we have. So that's just a hugely positive development. I think that the principle that makes sense to drive policy in this area is empowering parents to provide the care and the environments that they want to. We may agree with their choices, we may disagree with their choices. It's hard for me to see on what basis you or I or anyone else would be arguing there's a reason why it's better for us to choose than the parent. The parent's choices may be imperfect, but at least they're the parents, right? And so I do think that in this case, some of the reforms in our way of thinking about K-12 schooling that have occurred over decades of empowering parent choice in K-12 education, K-12 schooling, I should say, in this idea increasingly of the money following the child, is a principle that makes a lot of sense to apply in the area of early childhood development as well. The other piece that we haven't talked about that is also getting increasing attention that I think is extremely important and where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit is prenatal care. So particularly for disadvantaged populations, the quality of maternal prenatal care and then early maternal and infant care is very poor. And there's a rapidly growing body of research showing that the wins for children developmentally in the kind of prenatal care that their mothers receive are large and exceed any program outcomes. So that our conversation has really been focused from birth on, and that's very much at front and center. But to me, what states can do that will best support the development of young children and families and just be the right thing to do is to look at how to improve the prenatal care for disadvantaged parents in particular. That also forms the kind of foundation for that parent's functioning as a parent, and continuing to support parents through empowering choice for them. Now, exactly how to do that, there are plenty of states now that have charter school programs or voucher programs that are even looking at parents being able to use what money that was going to public schools to homeschooling. And I think that's the right direction. At the same time, we're not saying that all parents need to be home with their kids. We're not saying that all kids need to be in childcare. We're saying that both of those fit into families' lives, depending on the family, and that the best principle for guiding policy is to empower parents to make good choices.
I think that's a great kind of encapsulation and maybe a way to finish off the discussion. And we've touched on this in previous episodes where we talked about some of the policy initiatives happening here in Utah, some of the legislation that's already been passed with respect to a child tax credit, and also the state trying to invest or foster investment in still childcare centers. So it's kind of maybe a way to summarize it as we close out is it's not an either or. Let's stop pitting two things against one another. Let's say it's yes and. Let's give parents options to choose from and flexibility to actually choose those options so they're better empowered to create the ideal circumstances for themselves and their kids, which is what they're looking for in the survey data. And it also means that public policy should not put its thumb on the scale and bias in favor of one arrangement at the expense of others. Like you're saying, let parents choose from a suite of options, which really I think helps to serve to elevate the family as an institution and recognize how that as a core building block of our society, the family, is really important and just needs to be in top of mind for these policy conversations moving forward.
Yeah, exactly. So just to repeat, the research is extremely clear that the foundation of human flourishing is early childhood, and the foundation of healthy early childhood development is the family. So what that means is we promote human flourishing by supporting the families where the foundation for that is laid.
Well, Katharine, I want to thank you so much for joining us and lending all of your expertise and your time with your work on the Center on Child and Family Policy. Tell us where folks can go if they want to read more of what you're doing, if there's an opportunity for folks to get involved or be supportive. What's the best place to go to learn more about your work there?
So we would love it if people checked out our website at www.ccfp.org. And they can also find me on Twitter at KB Stevens.
I'll also add the plug that your podcast Early Matters for folks who want to really, again, that this has kind of been maybe a 101 level just because of my own constraints, learning from you, Katharine, but for folks who want to get an even deeper dive where you interview fellow experts in this space, the Early Matters podcast, I think is a great way to do that. It goes into a lot more depth with some of the things we talked about today.
Thanks so much, Nic.
Thank you again for joining us on Defending Ideas. We're going to take one final break before we leave you all with some talking points. We'll be right back. Stick around.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, we want to leave you with a few talking points that can kind of be framed as key principles that can help each of us as we're having conversations about this issue with family, friends, neighbors, or if we're talking to our elected officials about family policy or things like childcare. There are 3 key points that we can take away from the conversation today. Number 1, public policy should focus on empowering parents with choice and options without pushing one childcare arrangement over what a majority of parents actually want. Number 2, professional childcare can be a very important and valuable tool for families if it's part of a broad array of policy interventions, and it should be viewed as a beneficial, targeted intervention rather than a broad-based solution. And number 3, data around what parents ideally want for their kids and their families and what social science data says is helpful for early childhood development should remain front and center during all these policy conversations. Well, we hope you have enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. If you liked what you heard, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find short clips and full episodes that you can share on social media. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, all the major platforms. Just go to whichever provider you use to listen to your shows, search for Defending Ideas, and click subscribe. You can also subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel if you prefer to watch there. And lastly, if you want to support the great work of Sutherland Institute, please visit our website, sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That's all for this week's episode of Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.